Good afternoon.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the annual Wesley Literary Tea. My name is Vaughn Hoffman. I am the interim pastor here and director of the foundation for a few more months until the new director, who's been named and is on his way soon, will be here in July. But it's my privilege to be here with you this afternoon. This is my first tea. I love this whole idea of people coming together to encourage engagement in serious, thoughtful stories. I mean, we learn best through, I'm a person who's a big believer in stories and the power of them to make a difference in life. And so it's great that this has been a part of your history. The other thing, just very briefly, and I know not everybody here is a Methodist, but it may interest Methodists in the room. John Wesley had quite an extensive publishing career. Did you know that? He published many works, and in fact had one book in particular, which it was a self-help book. It's called Primitive Physic. He was concerned that poor people did not get good medical care in 17th, 18th century England, which was true. And so he published this book of homeopathic cures and diet supplements that would help preventive medicine. And there's a review of it. The Journal of American Medical Association did a review of this book, saying it was a combination of both good advice and superstition. That was kind of remarkable. But the interesting part of that was, back to Wesley, it went through 27 printings. It was enormously popular. And it was actually, Wesley did good both with the publishing of that book, but it made so much money for him. He lived as a pauper and died penniless, gave all his money away, but he made a ton of money from the 27 printings of Primitive Physic. So much of the Methodist beginnings have to do with the results of a bestseller. Just kind of an interesting tidbit. So with no more ado, let me offer a hearty welcome to you this afternoon, and we'll look forward to
Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending the Wesley Annual Literary Tea. So this year's theme, as you know, is historical fiction. And before we hear from each of our reviewers, perhaps a few brief remarks are in order. Throughout each of our lifetimes, we begin to recognize the crucial or pivotal or poignant moments through which we are living, including recently events like the murder of George Floyd, the COVID-19 pandemic, or the war in Ukraine, that make us aware that we are actually living through history and a particular historical moment. For many, these events are too fresh to be imagined into plot lines, but authors are already beginning to fictionalize them. As a genre, historical fiction is loosely defined as being set in a real place during a culturally recognizable time. The author has creative license, of course, and the details and the action of the story are generally a mix of actual events and ones from the author's imagination, as they indeed fill in the gaps. But the genre itself is not new. Herodotus's The Histories in 440 BC, for example, celebrates the unlikely Greek victory over the Persians from a century before him. But the genre truly flowers in contemporary form in the early 1800s, with titles like Ivanhoe as a popular example. Throughout that century, tales such as the Leatherstocking Tales, The Last of the Mohicans, War and Peace are more widely known. But in the 1900s, it really became an established favorite among readers. And as we progress through human civilization, which of course brings human conflict, the world wars in particular, but also just war in particular, has provided much fodder for authors of the genre. Indeed, the more painful episodes of the past are often those which authors thoroughly research, imaginatively relive, and then weave back into fictional form. As we now move into the third decade of the 21st century, titles in the genre abound. However, as we also now live in an unabashed media age, perhaps reflecting on the past feels different. A recent New York Times article argued that, quote, making sense of our lives in the unfathomable world in which we find ourselves has necessitated an understanding of what's come before, a clarification of the game and its stakes, but also its rules and positions. A new kind of historical fiction has evolved to show us that the past is no longer merely prologue, but story itself, shaping our increasingly fractured fairy tales about who we are as a society, end quote. It's this last notion, the idea that we have much to learn and much upon which to reflect, including both the sorrow and the resilience of the human condition, that we will hear more about today from each of our reviewers. With that, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Sands to talk about the book Pachinko.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And the Pachinko is a novel by Min Jin Lee. She is a Korean-American author. She was born in Korea, immigrating to the U.S. with her family in 1976. She grew up in Queens, graduated from Yale, finished law school, worked briefly as a corporate attorney in New York City. And then she left after a couple of years to write. And that was an excellent decision on her part. She is a prolific writer and recipient of many awards in US and Korea. Pachinko is the second of 3 novels she has produced. If you don't feel like reading, in 2022, the book was made into a drama series on Apple TV. I don't have Apple TV, and so I can't recommend it. I'm going to go off book for just a moment because the subject of the novel is the experience of Korean immigrants in Japan. I didn't know that there had ever been Korean immigrants in Japan. So that was one of the first of the many things I learned. So I'm going to give 2 things, a little bit of background about migration from Korea, and then I'm going to give a little bit of information about what happened to those immigrants in Japan after the Second World War. So by 1939, there were about 419,000 Koreans living in Japan in poverty-ridden ghettos, which were created by racial discrimination and low wages. This is something I never even knew. Japan initiated forced Korean immigration due to World War II between 1939 and 1945 because of labor shortage. Between 700,000 and 800,000 Koreans were forced to immigrate. And then in 1945, when the war was over, between 1 and 1.4 million Koreans returned home, leaving about 600,000 immigrants behind. And that is a number that remains constant today. Before the war, the Korean immigrants who made Japan their home were considered Japanese nationals. This meant they could vote. They couldn't live outside their ghettos, but they were encouraged to marry Japanese people. So there was a bit of inclusion. Immediately following the war, World War II ending, and I mean immediately, this group's right to vote was canceled. And the second thing that happened was they were no longer considered nationals, but they were considered aliens, and this is all done legally. And then after 1945, they put employment policies in place that prevented this group of immigrants from working in all Japanese jobs. And that is in both the public and the private sector. So, this is, I'll go back, but they lost other rights. Again, legally, they were aliens, and they lost some rights to some care that they had. So with that, that gives you a little bit of background. So the first thing that I didn't know what a pachinko was. Well, it turns out that pachinko, according to the online information, is a game of chance played with steel balls dropped into the top of the machine and guided to the bottom by pegs. Where the balls land determines a win or a loss. The modern version can be compared to a slot machine. After World War II, the Japanese became absolutely obsessed with the game, which still enjoys an outstanding popularity today. Pachinko's importance to the Korean immigrant community cannot be overemphasized. Because, as I mentioned, after World War II, they were excluded from all other occupations. So if you didn't have much of a choice, you either owned or worked in a pachinko parlor, you could be a gangster, and this was commonly happen. You could work in the service industry or a restaurant, and all of these were aimed at the Japanese population. It really makes sense that the author used the game as a book title, because I feel that pachinko can serve as a metaphor for either the difficult life of the Korean immigrant or the outcome of the game, because neither one was certain. This book examines in great detail the experience of Korean immigrants living in Japan over a 60-year period from around 1933 to 1989. It does this by examining the lives of a single immigrant family whose experience represents the whole. In the novel, the family experiences racial discrimination, unfair pay, and career and work restrictions. They also are restricted to live in the ghettos. What stands out are the qualities of this family as they struggle to survive in this unwelcoming society. They do this by hard work, a regard for education, exhibiting love and concern for one another, and Christian belief. They endure in spite of everything. These are people to respect and admire. It is also a novel about power and its abuse. I'm going to go next to give the outline of the story of the novel. This is absolutely bare bones. Think the third day of the turkey after Thanksgiving, because the book Pachinko is a wonderful book. It is very detailed. It has the basic story, which I will relate, but then it also has many others. You can learn, as I did, a great deal. One of the things I learned, and I was so embarrassed, I had no idea that Japan had annexed or colonized Korea. And I felt like an idiot, but it was just as I knew that's the reason for the immigration. Book one deals with, it's divided into 3 books. Book one deals with the period between 1910 and annexation date to 1933. It begins on a small Korean island and concludes in 1933 in a Korean ghetto in Osaka, Japan. Sunja, a primary character in the novel, lives with her mother who runs a small boarding house. At 16, she becomes involved with Ko Han-soo, an attractive, older, wealthy Korean man, and becomes pregnant. She expects marriage, but then she learns he is already married with children and angrily refuses his offer to support her as his mistress. What she does not know that he is a successful gangster and that their lives will remain intertwined throughout their lives. She's fortunate in that she marries Isaac, a Korean Christian minister staying at the inn. Isaac is frail, does not expect to live long, and marries Suchan to do a good thing before he dies. They travel to Osaka and move in with Isaac's brother and sister-in-law, and Sunja, who's used to the outdoors and a beautiful setting, is appalled at the ghetto. Book 2 covers the period between 1939 and 1968. This I found to be the most interesting part. Sunja now has 2 sons, Noah, Hansu's son, and Mosatsu, Isaac's son. It is the Second World War, and Isaac, for hardly any reason, is imprisoned and tortured by the Japanese. He is eventually released and dies soon after returning home. Money is always a problem, and Sunja and her sister-in-law, in order to make ends meet, begin making and selling kimchi, and it becomes extremely popular. But as the war continues, everything is more and more difficult to get, and eventually they cannot get the materials needed. But they are offered a job by the owner of a restaurant to make kimchi. And so they are saved, they can, keep the family going. The restaurant has to come to a close, and that's when she learns that Hansu, the father of Noah, actually owns the restaurant and has been looking out for them. As wartime conditions worsen, Hansu sends a family to the country and also brings her mother from Korea. Isaac's brother is sent to Nagasaki, and then where he is badly burned in the bombing and spends the rest of his life as an invalid and in pain, but is taken care of by the family. After the war is over, the family returns to Osaka, and the boys, Noah and Mosaku, return to school. Noah, who's always studious, passes his exams to attend university, but of course, there's no money. But unknown to Noah, Hansu pays his son's expenses. And the boy is very happy for a couple of years in school until by accident, he learns that Hansu is his father, who is a gangster and, in his opinion, has bad blood. He freaks out in the vernacular. He quits university, disowns his family, and disappears. Mosaku also drops out of school, but he hates school, and he goes to work in a pachinko parlor. Mosaku marries and has a son, Solomon, who is Sunja's only grandchild. In the third and final book, in the area of 1962 to 1969, Noah is working as a bookkeeper in a pachinko parlor, passing as Japanese. He marries a Japanese woman and has 4 children, never having anything or contacting his family. They have no idea he's there. Sunja, who is saddened by the 16 years of silence, contacts Hansu and asks him to locate Noah, which he does. Impatient to see her son, Sunja goes to him against Hansu's advice. They visit. He says he will be coming to see her. She leaves. He commits suicide. In the meantime, Musasu has become exceedingly wealthy through owning pachinko parlors. He is dating a Japanese divorcee, and although they both love each other, she refuses to marry him because her children and family would disapprove. His son, Solomon, is sent to the U.S. to study at Columbia University, and he does very well. He returns to Japan with his Korean-American girlfriend, Phoebe, to work for a British company. And while things go well at the beginning, there is a perceived difficulty with an old Korean woman who died in the midst of selling property to them. They blamed him for the trouble and fired him. And so, at the end of the novel, his girlfriend returns to the state, and Solomon makes the decision to stay in Japan and work with his father in the pachinko business. The novel is very good, and I would recommend it highly. As I said, this is the easy way to get history. You read this, you sympathize with the characters, and then you learn things that you never knew. The characterizations are very good, and there are so many interesting people aside from just the ones that I talked about, so I left a lot out. The thing I liked most about it was learning how about the history of the Korean immigrant community, which, as I said at the beginning, I knew nothing about. And I felt like this was a truly excellent book and a very enjoyable use of my time. So I recommend it highly, and are there any questions?
Thank you, Carolyn, for that. I think it's an appropriate metaphor as both as a plot element and as a symbolic reflection, the idea of a game of chance, which is, I think, how many people, particularly in oppressive conditions, think of life sometimes. And perhaps it's a testament to both perspective and universality that many of those same themes apply in the next novel that we're going to learn about, that Haratumi is going to review for us, called Trust. And one possible thing to kind of keep in mind might be that Book 1 of Pachinko and Trust loosely overlap, time-wise, chronologically.
Hi, good afternoon. Arth to me. Oh, let's bring my book up. My book was Trust by Hernan Diaz, published last year, late last year. Didn't know anything about the book, didn't know anything about the author. Trusted Kara and Annette in their recommendation. And it was a good book. It was challenging to figure out. I read the whole thing, of course, and at the end I go, okay, what did I just read here? So I had to, and that referred me to a couple of book reviews, and I went back, and I almost think I should have read the reviews before the book, or now you have to read the book again, and okay, now, all right, I see it. But a little background, Hernan Diaz, his first book was a 2017 Pulitzer Prize finalist. Kind of like our first presenter. He is a immigrant from Argentina. His parents were political activists in the anti-Perón regime. And when she was deposed in a military coup, his family fled to Sweden, where he decided that he was going to live in English. And so everything's English. I mean, not that I know Spanish anyways, but just making that decision, I didn't know it was that easy. But. So anyways, trust. What is it? Is it a verb or is it a noun? Is it a noun about a financial institution, the trust, the clever invention of John D. Rockefeller to avoid monopoly, but same impact? Is it a book about how you accumulate through a trust, capital and power? Or is it a verb? Who do you trust? How do you trust? What is trust? How much trust do you put in anything or anybody or any institution? Again, I didn't know any of that going in. And as it turns out, Trust is really 4 novels. All of them are intertwined with an America at the dawn of the 20th century, when industrialists and their quest and lust for power dominated everything. These were men who they sought power and profits, not the presidency. They wanted to control corporations and capital, not Congress. And they wanted to control the narrative of how their lives were written. And they were determined to do so. And to a large extent, they did. The Gilded Age. You know, we admire them, and yet, you know, we know they're very troubled as well. But it's really, to follow up on that, it's the story of our troubled relationship with the rich and the powerful. It's really a mixed bag. We love, hate the aristocracy, and we love stories about them, whether it's, you know, failed, Great Gatsby. This book's been compared to The Great Gatsby. Diaz rejects that. All we know in The Great Gatsby is that Jay Gatsby's a bondsman. That's it. You know, he's really a bootlegger, but nonetheless. Whereas in this book, they do go into a lot of the detail, if you like any of that stuff, financial instruments. It's a look at how history's written, and by whom. And that's a recurring theme all through history. Napoleon said history's nothing but lies. Well, he knew, being defeated, they were not going to say good things about him. Henry Ford, history's bunk. You know, he realized at the end, history's not going to be that kind to him for some of the things he said. You know, Carlyle, history's just written by the winners. We know that. Well, what is history, really? So you plunge in, you read the book, and it's four stories. One is a novella about a financier at the turn of the century who rides the American story through bull markets and bear markets, you know, saving the government, saving the economy, all in a time where there were no government safety nets or institutions, or no FDIC or anything like that. And much to his chagrin, he's not thanked for it. He's not recognized. He's attacked. And so the first story is a loosely written memoir of his life, trying to kind of gussy it up a little bit. The second one is a story by a ghostwriter who he hires to, again, try and, you know, sell his story to the general public. So he's tried once. He's hired a ghostwriter to do it a second time. His third one is an autobiographical memoir of the ghostwriter, who's remembering all the things she did in trying to get the story, particularly from a female perspective. And, you know, not knowing that you're going to read really four stories, the first one is a heartbreaking story of rise to riches and fame and ultimate denouement when his wife suffers a mental health crisis, and the treatment of the day. You know, we can all imagine this, whether it's electroshock or huge doses of drugs or spas in Switzerland or baths wherever, all to no avail, and she dies a tragic death, and he does as well. And then the fourth story, the fourth short novel, again coming out of nowhere, is the wife's story, her life story. Where'd this come from? And as it turns out, she's the financial genius. She's the real power of the story. It wasn't him at all. It was her. She was the mathematical savant. She was the one who was able to time the market. Now again, it's a novel. You know, you can do that really. Yeah, maybe once or twice. But, so then it dawned on me, and cheating, the reviewer said it as well. That's really his theme. It's the lost history of feminism and the unspoken voice of women throughout history. Not just necessarily as the power behind, but the actual force. And so it's interesting coming from Diaz that that would be his theme. But I'm going to say a co-theme to it is this larger issue of history, especially as Carolyn mentioned in the first presentation, in today's times, where are we with it? You know, this effort to bend and align reality to what powers that be want it to be. We see this. We see this now. Catch and kill journalism. Fixed news points. You know, what is history and how is it shaped by, I mean, it's always had an ulterior motive, but you know, the mixed bag we have with money, the exaltation and the repression is merely one part of that. What do you focus on? It's like a pendulum. Sometimes we love the rich and powerful, and sometimes we want to excoriate them. And you know, like everything, there's a mix of both. Two things, and I'll stop. For a guy who taught himself English from Spanish, and one of the book reviewers even mentioned this, he has a vocabulary that is unbelievable. I do the New York Times crossword puzzle every day, and the only thing I don't like is when I run across a word I've never seen before. Now, I've seen a lot of words. Page 99, one paragraph. Lacrimoros. Anybody?
Yeah.
Tearful. Lexical. Nature of language. Circumlocutions. Using too many words. Huh. Lacuna.
Gaps.
Huh?
Gaps.
A gap. Very good. Very good. All right, Baroque I got because I was taught you go broke going for Baroque. And erupts, I-R-R. Not erupts, I-R-R. Enter forcefully. One paragraph. Oh. Had every one of those words. Now come on, turn on. Come on. And I'll wrap up with this. For a guy who wrote about the rich and powerful and our mixed emotions or our mixed reaction to them, he recognizes this too. He was interviewed for one of these book reviews while sitting in recently, he was a fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center at Lake Como, which I believe is in Switzerland. Italy, okay. He also, $20 million grant from the Carnegie Corporation. And he, during the COVID, the New York Library was closed, kept open the Coleman Center for him. So he's doing okay. As you know, torn as he may be, and he realizes that, he recognizes that too. He's not living in some oblivious world. But anyway, you know, again, I would recommend the book now that you have maybe some overview of what it's about. But if you just go in cold, Annette and Kara, it really does require kind of a second review to kind of get it. But anyway, thank you guys, and I would recommend it, of course.
So I have to admit, I also went into it cold, but I had like an ulterior motive. I teach English courses, and I'm a little tired of Gatsby after 18 years, and I thought like, oh, this could be a really nice replacement. And then about 6 paragraphs in, I thought, no, that's probably not. A little bit more vocabulary work than we would have needed. But I think some of the themes that you mentioned in terms of troubled relationships with the rich and the powerful, and maybe now shifting a little bit more into troubled relationship with ideology, but still the questions of who tells history and whose stories are there and how it's humanized are all things that we're also now going to hear from. with Sarah Kelly's review of All the Light We Cannot See.
Thanks. Well, so when Annette approached me about reviewing a book, I was hesitant, but as soon as she showed me, the first book that she had on was All the Light We Cannot See, and I had to say yes because it's one of my most favorite books of all time. And actually, I'll admit, it's been a few years ago since I read it, so I had to brush up a little bit. But anyway, and I'm going to talk about the length a little bit, so don't be off put by necessarily the size of the book. So All the Light We Cannot See is written by an American author, Anthony Doerr, and it was first published in May of 2014, and it was very quickly a commercial success and on the New York Times bestseller list, in fact for 200 weeks. It ultimately sold over 15 million copies, winning the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the 2015 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. The author, more Midwestern actually, which is interesting. I was surprised after I read the book. He was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. He's now 49 and lives in Boise, Idaho, with his wife and twin teenage sons. So he was, I'd say, fairly young when he wrote this book. Much of this book takes place in the years leading up to and during World War II. Between 1934 and 1945. And it traces a story of two main characters whose lives, interestingly, do not intersect until around page 411 of the book. And so that, for me, in the beginning, it was confusing, maybe a little bit like the last book, but then it started, to come together. The first character is Marie-Laure LeBlanc, or Laure LeBlanc, a French girl who is blind, and the other character is Werner Pfennig, a young German boy. And I think I'll just share right up front what the takeaways for me from this book that's still, unfortunately, very relevant today. That first, that there are many victims of war, no matter what side you're fighting on, and especially how it impacts children. And then the second takeaway for me, there was a lot in this book, but the top two for me, that in war, the human instinct to survive may force us to make choices that we would not consider in times of peace. So I'm going to first share the I'm going to try to just highlights of these two different stories. It goes back and forth, and so that's what makes it challenging in some ways, but the chapters are very, very short, so that part I liked. So some information about Marie-Laure. Early in the book, we learn that she grows up in Paris, where her father, Daniel, works as a trusted locksmith at the Museum of Natural History. As a 6-year-old girl who is blind, her father teaches her to navigate independently by building her a scale model of her Parisian neighborhood to learn from. Every house, every sewer drain is included, and so she can memorize it with her fingers and then navigate the real streets with her feet and cane. But of course, the city changed very rapidly in the late 30s. By 1940, when she was 12 years old, it became very apparent from the German occupation that was occurring that they needed to leave Paris quickly. So Marie-Laure and her father fled for Saint-Malo, which is located about 200 miles west of Paris on the English Channel. And there they moved in with a reclusive great-uncle, Etienne, and his housekeeper. And we learn, once they move in, they didn't know the uncle very well, and he's actually was a veteran himself, and a little bit of PTSD from that war. But he had quite a collection of antique radios and transmitters. And he had used those earlier in his life to broadcast recordings of science programs to children. And anyway, so that was an interesting thing that you wouldn't have expected from this reclusive great uncle. Unbeknownst to Marie-Laure, though, her father leaves Paris because his boss asked him to take something with him. The Museum of Natural History owns a legendary diamond called the Sea of Flames Under the threat of occupation and theft, the museum directors make 3 copies. And I think that was very common back then with art because they knew that it's very likely that their precious holdings might be taken to Germany. So they made copies of this diamond. 3 of the 4 stones are sent off with various staff, including Daniel, as he was the very trusted employee. And the final one remains at the museum, but nobody knows who has the real diamond. Once they arrive in St. Malo, Daniel builds a new scale model of the town for his daughter so that she can navigate it. But this time he hides the diamond in the replica he makes. It's not long after that he's summoned under false pretense to go back to Paris, and sadly he's arrested and sent to Germany and imprisoned. So this leaves Marie-Laure, 12 years old, blind, with her great uncle and the housekeeper. And the threat of war just continues to grow very quickly, and the 3 then they decided in different stages though to support the resistance against the German occupiers. And Marie-Laure finds an effective way to share secrets, messages with the Allies, placing Morse code in the loaves of bread that her housekeeper makes. No one suspects a girl who is blind or the housekeeper would be capable of foiling the enemy. And this reminds me of a different, actually, nonfiction novel that I just, or not, it's not a novel, nonfiction book that I read about a woman with who was a spy for the Allies who had a wooden leg. And also, and that's another book that I would highly recommend. But anyway, so if you had any type of disability back then, people didn't think you were capable of anything. Her uncle, on the other hand, brings his powerful radio transmitters out of hiding that he's had in the attic, and he begins broadcasting messages to the Allies. So that sets the stage for Marie-Laure, her uncle, and her situation in St. Malo. Now we're going to switch to Werner Femmig, who is a German boy who grows up in an orphanage. Despite the lack of formal education, Werner is extremely bright. His life starts to change when he and his sister find an abandoned radio. On his own, at age 7, he figures out how to repair the radio, and much to his amazement, it allows him to listen to a mysterious French program where a man explains scientific concepts in simple language, and it's geared for children. He's amazed that this box can transmit a voice from so far away. He listens to every episode possible. So 7 years later, at the age of 14, by then he becomes a master at building and fixing radios, a talent that wins him a place in an elite military academy. He hopes that this opportunity as an orphan is going to provide him a brighter future, but not good timing for him. Once he's at school, Werner quickly realizes what the Nazi regime is like and is shocked by its cruelty and brutality. And then 2 years after, at the age of 16, he's basically ordered to serve the military, even though he's technically not young enough to be in the military, but they change his birth date. So, and he's given the job to track down any civilians who use illegal radios to help the Allies. Although Werner tries to ignore the moral conflict he experiences, he is horrified by what he sees. And by the spring of 1944, he and his colleagues are sent to the seaside town of, where else? St. Malo, where he discovers that a man with the same voice as the one from the program he left as a child is broadcasting secret codes. So what a dilemma he has and how conflicted he is. So this was a point where he really was quite brave. He decided to not tell anybody about this transmission that he was hearing and from where. But he spies on the house because he figures out where it's coming from and catches sight of a girl living at the house who is blind. So this is where we get to approach page 400 and something. And at the same time, there's just a little side thing that I wasn't going to mention, but my daughter read the book and thought this was so important, that there's about the diamond. I mentioned earlier that her dad had hidden the diamond in that wooden replica. There's a Nazi official, really nasty guy, von Rumpel, who becomes obsessed with finding this diamond. And he finally traces it to the house in Saint Malo. They found all the others and they're fake, so there's one left. So he actually comes to Marie Laur's father, the house that he last lived, even though he's now in Germany. And so everything kind of culminates at the late summer of 1944, and there is really a war in summer of 44 in August in Saint Malo. It was occupied at the time by more than 8,000 Germans, and this is not a big town. And the Allies began bombing and almost totally destroying the town. And where I'm going to stop with this, because I really would like to encourage you to read the book, where I'm going to stop is that Werner is trapped in a cellar when a building collapses on him. Marie Laure is alone in her house, can't escape, and this Nazi Van Rumpel is trying to find the diamond. He comes to the house to search for it. She hears a stranger. She runs up to the attic, hides herself, takes the transmitter, and for 4 days she starts transmitting again. And lo and behold, Werner hears her, is receiving all her messages. So that's the first 2/3 of the book. And as I said, it's really thick, but it's one that you can't stop reading as long as you realize in the beginning that ultimately these stories do come together. So as I said, the takeaways for me, again, were really impressed upon me because I don't know, I always grew up thinking that all the Germans and anybody with the Nazis were really bad, and I've come to realize as I've gotten older that honestly they didn't have a choice, many of them. Some did, but clearly some didn't, and clearly in this case, this young teenage boy, you know, it was survival for him. And anyway, I guess I'm thinking about now with Ukraine and Russia, and I'm sure that there are similar situations that, you know, there are young teenage boys or just men in general who are forced into that war that really don't support it. So anyway, the last thing I'd just like to say is the title, All the Light We Cannot See. Where did that come from? So I was looking at everybody's different interpretations, and none of them really spoke to me. So what I would say, for me, that the word light is used as a symbol of hope. Marie Laure is blind. She lives in darkness, but she's determined to survive, and despite a horrific situation, and her father does eventually die, so she's orphaned. She does not give up hope, and I just, like, it's so admirable. And then you have Werner, who was born sighted, but very poor, also an orphan, and he saw darkness through his country's support of the Nazi regime, but his choice was basically to support the war or be killed. Yet I feel like he did not give up hope, and especially once he finds a house in Saint Malo, and I will go ahead and tell you that they do meet. I will tell you that much. So if I were to advise this, or if I were to be the author of this book, I love the title because I think it's intriguing, and it makes you stop and think, but I also could see the title being All the Hope We Cannot See. So, and I guess I'm thinking that's a lesson for all of us, maybe similar to your sermon today, is to not give up hope. So, thank you. And if anybody, I would like to borrow the copy, I'd be happy to loan it to you, and my name's in it, and I highly recommend it. So, thank you.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to try some of the cookies. Thank you to everybody who brought refreshments for this event. It made it truly feel homey and literary. And so I think one kind of thing to keep in mind is I want to pull back to something that Sarah just said during her review. And she talked about two themes or takeaways that she noticed in terms of the fact that there are many victims of war, and also that there's a human instinct to survive. And oftentimes that comes down to creative resistance, which I think is going to be a thread among the 3 novels that we have left to review. So with that, We are now going to hear from Dick Flood about the novel Ceremony.
Well, Annette asked me to read The Ceremony. It's a book by Leslie Silko, if I pronounce that correctly, S-I-L-K-O. The Ceremony tells the story of Toro, T-A-Y-O, Teo, a mixed-blood Native American from the Pueblo Reservation, who was severely traumatized by his unstable childhood and combat experience in World War II. Now, Silko uses a complex, fragmented, linear plot to represent Teo's psychological struggles. This makes the book extremely hard to figure out what's going on, because if you're like me and you read mostly nonfiction, it goes from point A to point C, B to point C. Well, in this novel, you're using the experience of Teo, who's in one moment thinking at one time, another moment he's into another time or another place. So it's one incident to another, and it's not following a logical pattern. So at first, this book seemed to be largely about endless circle of violence, exploitation of the oppressed people, and freaking to solve their problems. And I was further confused when I read the review on the back of the cover, which says in part, Ceremony is the greatest novel in Native American literature. It's one of the greatest novels of any time or place. The author of this review says, I have read this book so many times, I probably have it memorized. I teach it, I learn from it, I'm continually amazed at its power, beauty, its violence, and its vision. So obviously I was missing something. At this point, Annette came to my rescue and sent me an email saying, quote, this is quite a serious read. And she suggested I read the Wikipedia write-up on Ceremony, which fortunately she sent to me. And looking further, I read a review, which I found at the Champaign Public Library on Hoopla. And it's just a study guide for Leslie Silko's Ceremony, which I simply downloaded. It was on Hoopla. So with these references, I think mentioned in your book, that it would have been helpful right at the beginning of your sort of review to know what the hell it was all about. So anyway, these are very valuable resources, and I'd recommend if you read this book, go to the Champaign Public Library, look up Wikipedia. So this is very important because it tells you about the personalities of the major characters, Indian culture, religion, tradition, the matriarchal society, and the Pueblo concept of evil. In this book, you just can't skip around from one point to another, because if you do, you're going to miss something really important. Somebody will make a casual comment, and at the end of the book, it might result in the person's living or dying. And in addition, the matriarchal culture is often practiced in a very quiet way in the book, and yet it's extremely important. So, getting back to the book, like many veterans, Teo continues to re-experience the psychological traumas even after returning home from the war. His problems are only compounded by his friends who encourage him to use alcohol as a way to escape from his reality. Now, when Emo, another Native American veteran, begins bragging about how much he enjoyed killing people during the war, Teo's uneasiness erupts. And essentially he tries to kill his former friend. But his friends, they stop him from killing him, and he's committed to a psychological hospital in Los Angeles, an Army psychological hospital. But he knows that they can't solve his problems. Now, some of the doctors in the audience might disagree with me, but Teo's version or his insight is that white medicine can't help him because it looks at one symptom, not the entire sickness that he's dealing with. So I don't know, you might disagree with that, but that's his view. And so he's carrying other burdens, such as he's carrying the sins of his mother, physically and mentally. As a youth, he was abused by his aunt. Further stress comes from being a member of an oppressed people. In addition, he's very hard on himself, because when he's in the Philippines, he and his cousin Rocky are on a death march. And his cousin dies. Well, he blames himself for this, because in his view of religion, which their view was connected to nature and to the animals, he feels responsible because he curses all the rain, he curses the flies, which are everywhere. And because of this, he feels responsible for the drought, or the drought on the reservation. So he's a very troubled man, and how does he solve those problems? So eventually, he is let go from the hospital and returns to the reservation. And with the help of the medicine man on the reservation, he's directed on a complex path to restore his psychological health. And this again comes into religion, because in the matriarchal society, because women dominate important decisions. You know, women are the ones who control property. For example, you would get married, you wouldn't go to the father's house, you go to the mother's house. Example of that would be the early Americans, when they were trying to decide how they should rule, they went and studied the Iroquois in upstate New York. And the women's rights movement made connections because the women were the ones who made important decisions. I think you have many examples in the book of that, where key moments, the women are the ones making the decisions. And if you're not aware of that, you completely miss the book, because it's very subtle. So going on, let's see what I have. As part of his ceremony for recovery, he sets out on this quest, and it's an extended quest, to find his uncle's missing cattle. In searching for the cattle, the author Sokol observes, I'm going to quote here, all but a small part of the mountain he is on has been taken from his people. The reservation boundaries included only a canyon and a few miles of timber on the plateau. The rest of the land was taken by the National Forest and the state, which later sold it to white ranchers who came from Texas in the early 1900s. In the 20s and 30s, loggers came and stripped the canyons below the rim and cut great clearings on the plateau slopes. The logging companies hired full-time hunters who fed entire logging camps, taking 10 to 15 deer each week and up to 50 turkeys in a month. The loggers shot bears and lions for sport. It was then that the Laguna people understood that the land had been taken because they couldn't stop the white people from coming to destroy the animals and the land. So the book continues on with that point where he's searching for his uncle's cattle. And he finally finds the cattle, and he frees the cattle. But just as he's freed the cattle, the white ranch hands find him, and he's detained. But he gets out of that. And there's other stories too, where the women come and save him because of the matriarchal society and its importance. So the Wikipedia review says, and quote, throughout the novel, Sokol delves into the complexities of being caught between multiple world views and cultures. The author focuses on the importance of blending the cultures showing how Teo can only regain his health when he chooses how to identify by creating his own world that bridges the gap. Through ceremony, Silko invites the reader to look at the witchery, W-I-T-C-H-E-R-Y, within everyone, and points out the steps one can take to create healing and wholeness. So with that in mind, I'd recommend the book to anyone. I'd say this difficult book to anyone. And hopefully you'll find it much rewarding as I did. I'd like to mention two other things in passing. I was wondering why he called it ceremony. So I looked up ceremony. It's essentially the transition from one point, from one life to another. I guess in the Methodist Church, you'd say like a marriage is a ceremony, where you're transferring from being single to taking on the responsibilities of being married. And one more thing about bridging the gap. Jeannie and I visited Andrew Jackson's house, and about 40 feet from the back door were the slave quarters. You can see a couple rows of slaves, primitive cabins, but they'd have 10 to 12 people in each cabin. He was supposedly a very religious man, but you see that moment in history, and I'm thinking of the Trail of Tears and how they dealt with the Indians coming, the Indians' land and the white man coming onto it. Compared to 2009, they had the American Indian Land Trust settlement, which the government wound up paying around $3.5 billion for Indian leases that weren't paid. So, thank you, and I think get some background information. Oh, and by the way, there might be a list of books on the back here, which might be interested to go to the ceremony. But it was a good read.
Yeah.
I'm glad that Dick felt open to tell us how he really felt about the process of reading what is a really challenging but important book. And it was interesting too that you mentioned the title, because 4 of the 6 titles, all of the weight is carried by one word, at least from this: pachinko, trust, ceremony, homegoing. And so I think now, as we hear from Sharon about homegoing, there might be some mention of that or might not, but again, a lot of the themes are going to be interwoven in between.
I think our whole day is interwoven because I have reference to Harth's book, and I have read, it just, everybody's ties together in many, many ways. And it's not just historical fiction. My book is Homegoing, and this cover anyway, not in your program, is kente cloth, and that is a way of storytelling in the African culture. So that's what this book cover is about. This book was published in 2016. I read it in 2018, and it was really good for me to reread it 5 years later. Because I think the first time I read a book, I get the overview. And then this time I thought, oh, I have to give a book review. So I better really pay attention. And I got so much more out of it this time by paying attention to what the author was really saying. The structure of the novel was another one that went back and forth between 2 sisters. And these 2 half-sisters had the same mother and different fathers. They did not grow up together. They did not know each other. But they both ended up in Ghana. And that's a West African country where many of the slave ships debarked for the Americas. And even today, Ghana's most famous tourist attraction is this Cape Coast Castle. This is where the novel started, with one sister being married to one of the British colonists, and she lived upstairs in luxury, even though she was, well, actually Congolese. And then the other sister had been sold into slavery, and she was imprisoned in the dungeons under the castle. So here we have two half-sisters, one living oblivious to what was going on down here. And they never meet. So their story only goes through their children. In the case of this novel, Essie was the one who was the slave, and Effia was the one who married the white British man and had quite a easy and luxurious life. On the other hand, being sold into slavery, and at some point Effia did realize what was going on down there, and it had problems. It gave her problems. But moving right on, we leave them and move on to their children. So every chapter is one person, and that kind of made it easy to say, okay, I'm going to read this one today. And they're all told in a storytelling manner. So the reading was easy. And I will tell you, there was Quay and Ness. There was James and Kojo, Abina and Age, Akua and Willie, Yaw and Sonny, Marjorie and Marcus. And that's how, those are the names of the chapters, but you had to go from the slaves' offsprings to the lady who lived quite an easy life. Each story could stand alone, and each story had some reference to a historical event or a cultural type of telling through a cultural story. One is Anansi, and Anansi was a spider, and this is a folk tale from Africa, and Anansi was lazy, and then he got the birds to shake down the mangoes from the tree. And there are many folk tales about Anansi and what he got other people to do. And I think that permeated all of the stories of the people in this book. I especially appreciated an explanation of history in Yaw's chapter. And Yaw became a school teacher. He had been severely scarred, and so he was burned, and his face was very deformed. So some people decided he could be a teacher because he was not an attractive person. So in the vein of storytelling, I'm going to read just a little bit about Yaw teaching school. Since I was a teacher, this really appealed to me. He is in his first day of class of a new term, and he says, or they say, Yaw watched them. He could always tell which boy would raise his hand first by the way he pushed forward in his seat and moved, ready to raise his hand. And the Of course, there are the children who don't do that. But anyway, this time a very small boy named Peter raised his hand. And Yaw had asked, what does the board say? And little boy Peter raises his hand and it says, history is storytelling. And we've heard that all afternoon. Peter answered, and he smiled with pent-up excitement. History is storytelling, Yaw repeated. He walked down the aisles between the rows of seats, making sure to look each boy in the eye. Remember, this is the first day of the term. Who would like to tell the story of how I got my scar? Students began to squirm, their limbs growing limp and wobbly. They looked at each other, coughed, and looked away. Don't be shy, Yaw said, smiling now, nodding encouragingly. Peter, he asked. The boy who only seconds before had been so happy to speak began to plead with his eyes. The first day with a new class was always Yaw's favorite. And I don't know how to say his name. They called him Mr. So-and-so. We'll just say Yaw. But Peter said, so, what story have you heard about my scar? Yaw asked, smiling still, hoping now to ease some of the child's growing fear. Peter cleared his throat and looked at the ground. They say you were born of fire, he started, that this is why you are so smart, because you were lit by fire. Anyone else? Timidly, a boy named Eden raised his hand. They say your mother was fighting evil spirits from Asamando, which is a native spirit. Then William, I heard your father was so sad by the Asante loss that he cursed the gods, and the gods took vengeance. Another named Thomas. I heard you did it to yourself so that you would have something to talk about on the first day of class. All of the boys laughed, and Yaw had to stifle his own amusement. Word of his lesson had gotten around, he knew. The older boys told some of the younger ones what to expect from him. Now we get into the serious part. And he says, whose story is correct? And this goes for us today, ladies and gentlemen. The bright boys of the uncertain Gold Coast were learning the White Book from a scarred man. They looked around at each other. Finally, once the murmuring subsided, Peter raised his hand. Mr. Ajikam, we cannot know which story is correct. He looked at the rest of the class, understanding slowly. We cannot know which story is correct because we were not there. Yaw nodded. This is the problem of history. We cannot know that which we were not there to see and hear and experience for ourselves. We must rely upon the words of others and hear and experience for ourselves. Those who were there in the olden days, they told stories to their children. And so that those children would know, they could tell stories on to their own children. And so on and so on. But now we come upon the problem of conflicting stories. One person says the warriors came to their village with blue coats on. Another said the warriors came in red coats. Whose story do we believe? The boys were silent. They stared at him, waiting. We believe the one who has power. He is the one who gets to write the story. So when you study history, you must always ask yourself, whose story am I missing? And I think that came out in everybody's book today, almost. But just this morning, we were reading that they've rewritten Rosa Parks' story. That it's not that she couldn't sit because of someone telling her she was black and had to move, but because she moved to the back of the bus. And that's what he was kind of saying is, well, what's the story we don't know? And if we don't hear and look for other stories, we won't know that. Back to the book, though, as far as I was having my experience with it, is one of the ever-present themes was the issue of rape or interracial marriage resulting in light-skinned people and how they affected their own relationships with others. And then there were the two stones, and I thought about the diamonds. There were two stones which were introduced early in the novel, with each sister being presented one by their mother. And one stone figures into the end of the book, and the other's just lost. It's lost in history. And so we never find, we probably think it's in the dungeon under the castle. A little bit about the author. Yaa Gyasi was born in Ghana but did not remain there. Her parents settled in Alabama, where she grew up. As is often said, the first novels are often autobiographical, and this one is no exception. As the novel draws to a close, the final chapter draws some parallels to Yaa's own experiences, and those were Marjorie and Marcus's stories, and they're the only two that ever meet the two branches of the family. So let's see, and she has an impressive set of academic credentials. Yaa was raised in Huntsville, Alabama, and I think most of us know what, that's a very academic environment. And she holds degrees from Stanford University and the Iowa Writers Workshop. She now lives in Berkeley, California. And just for the Wesley folks, do any of you remember Phyllis Harris? Anybody remember her? Because I know at one time she was a Wesley member. I believe she had attended the Iowa Writers Workshop. And that was just a little bit of Wesley history on her. Any questions? Please read the book. It's a fine read.
I have to admit, I actually listened to that book, and I think it brought an interesting level to it too, because hearing the pronunciation and although it was really hard when it did skip from character to character, and I wanted more of each character, it could each be a story.
Did I come close?
I believe so, yeah. So finally we have a text from Barb Hughes, and it's a fascinating novel in scope, but it's a little different from where we've sort of been in terms of, I guess, the journey from Korea to America to Europe to Africa, and now we're going to hear from Barb. But one thing I was thinking as Sharon was speaking is that the character Yaa would probably get along with the main character in your novel. So here's Barb with Gentleman in Moscow.
I keep thinking with all of these, of the Hamilton line, it doesn't matter what your story is, it matters who lives and dies and tells your story, puts you in the narrative. Everything else is up to chance. My book is The Gentleman from Moscow by, I say M.R. Tolles, 2016. He was born in Boston, graduated from Yale, has an MA in English from Stanford. He spent 20 years as a financial investment professional, and now devotes himself full-time to writing. Guess you can do that with a liberal arts degree. He lives with his wife and 2 children in Manhattan. Gentleman from Moscow was his second book. This book was one I jumped on to review when asked by Annette. I had read it before several years ago, and as I usually do, I had the movie version already cast in my mind, and I definitely wanted to share it with the group. Do you know who Mark Rylance is? That's who I think is the gentleman, the actor. This book made me smile and laugh and learn and empathize with characters whom I had never thought much about before. All revolutionaries are not bad, and all aristocrats aren't good, and all common folks are not simple. Count Rostov knows this with certainty. One of the cover blurbs states, he can't leave, and you won't want to. And now I'll tell you why. The book opens in 1922, where the 30-year-old Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov lives in a splendorous suite of rooms at the Hotel Metropole, from where he can view the sights of Red Square. The Bolshoi, the Central Department Store, the Mainly Theater, and the Old Palace of Unions are right outside his gigantic windows. We find him in the defendant's box at the Bolshevik Tribunal Court in the Kremlin, an unrepentant aristocrat, standing trial for writing subversive poetry. It shows you the poem. I read the book, or read the poem, and it's about a lost time and somebody's peeling a pear and dreaming of old days in Russia. I didn't really see much subversion in that, but apparently they did. So let me just, bear with me, I want to read a couple of pages of the trial because you'll get his personality. So it's he and the prosecutor. Prosecutor Vizhinsky, state your name. Rostov. Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov, recipient of the Order of St. Andrew, member of the Jockey Club, master of the hunt. You may have your titles. They are of no use for anyone else. But for the record, are you not Alexander Rostov, born in St. Petersburg, 24 of October, 1897? I am he. Before we begin, I must say, I do not think I've ever seen a jacket so festooned with so many buttons. Rostov, thank you. It was not meant to be a compliment. In that case, I demand satisfaction on the field of honor. Laughter. The secretary says, silence in the gallery. What is your current address? Suite 317 at the Hotel Metropole, Moscow. How long have you lived there? I have been in residence there since the 5th of September, 1918. Just under 4 years. 1918 is an important. What is your occupation? It's not the business of a gentleman to have an occupation. Very well then, how do you spend your time? Dining, discussing, reading, reflecting, the usual rigmarole. And you write poetry? I have been known to fence with a quill. Belinsky, holding up his pamphlet. Are you the author of this long poem of 1913 called Where Is It Now? Rostov, it's been attributed to me. Why did you write that poem? Well, it demanded to be written. I simply happened to be sitting at the particular desk on the particular morning when I chose to make its demands. Where was that exactly? In the south parlor at Eidelhauer. Eidelhauer? That's the Rostov estate in Novgorod. Oh yes, of course, how apt. Let us return our attention to your poem, coming as it did. In the more subdued years after the failed revolt of 1905, many considered it a call to action. Would you agree with that assessment? Rostov, all poetry is a call to action. And it was in the spring of the following year you left Russia for Paris? I seem to remember the blossoms on the apple trees. Yes, in all likelihood it was in that spring. May 16th to be precise. Now we understand the reasons for your self-imposed exile, and we even have some sympathy with the actions that prompted your flight. What concerns us here is that you returned in 1918 to this city. One wonders if you came back with the intention of taking up arms, and if so, whether for or against the revolution. Rostov. By that point, I'm afraid that my days of taking up arms are behind me. Then why did you come back? Rostov, I missed the climate in Moscow. Count Rostov, you do not seem to appreciate the gravity of your position, nor do you show the respect that is due the men convened before you. Rostov, because Tsarina had the same complaints about me in her day. Prosecutor, if I may say, I have no doubt, Count Rostov, that many in the gallery are surprised to find you so charming, but I for one do not. I'm not surprised in the least. History has shown charm to be the final ambition of the leisure class. What I do find surprising is that the author of the poem in question could have become a man so obviously without purpose. Rostov, I have lived under the impression that a man's purpose is known only to God. How convenient that must be for you. The court recesses for 12 minutes for deliberation. And here's the verdict. Alexander Ilyich Rostov, taking into full account your own testimony, we can only assume that the clear-eyed spirit you wrote that poem in, where is it now, has succumbed irrevocably to the corruptions of his class, and now poses a threat to the very ideals. On that basis, our inclination would be to have you taken from this chamber and put against the wall. But there are those within the senior ranks of the party who count you among the heroes of the pre-revolutionary cause. Thus, it is the opinion of this committee that you should be returned to the Hotel Metropole, from which you are so fond, and make no mistake, should you ever set foot outside the Metropole again, you will be shot. Next matter. So that's his trial for writing the poem. And you get a quite bit of his personality in it. So, he is sentenced, and as he is escorted across the square to the Metropole, to the suite where he's lived for the past 4 years, he's taken aback when his guards push him past his old suite into the servants' quarters, up 3 floors into an attic dormer room, which contains a small iron bed and a 3-legged bureau. There's one tiny window to the outside world. The Count was allowed to take a few of his precious items from his previous suite. He chose a portrait of his only sister, 52 drinking glasses, his grandmother's porcelain plates, a battered old leather attaché case, and a very treasured desk from his godfather. His thoughts are that most of us spend our lives saying adieu to those we love, but we never learn to say goodbye to our possessions. The desk holds a secret. Emptying his glass later on in the afternoon after they left the room, the Count pushed his chair back, sat on the floor. He ran his hand behind the desk's front leg until he reached the catch, and when he pressed it, a seamless door opened to reveal a velvet, hollow, lined passage that, like the 3 other legs, was stacked with pieces of gold. That's why he treasured that desk. Like a kaleidoscope, so turns the events in Russia and inside the Metropole. The years roll on as Rostov lives his life, entertaining guests, eating in the dining room, reading and observing the comings and goings of people of the hotel. He befriends the common people around him, such as the hotel seamstress, from whom he learns to sew and mend, the handyman who teaches him about the varied kinds of honeybees and apple trees that are around the area, and the head waiter, Andreas, whom he advises on the wine cellar offerings. This waiter later succumbed to the People's Revolution, and he soaked all the labels off of 100,000 bottles of wine in the wine cellar in the name of equality. What do you do when you were ordering after that? You get red or white? He met and befriended an impetuous actress named Anna Urbanova, whom he loved and struggled with for many years of his life. He nearly succumbed to despair at one point and climbed out the attic hatch, but was stopped by the handyman, Abram. He had caught a whiff of some apple trees from his old estate 100 miles away. The bees had flown that far to Moscow, and the memory had brought him to a low point. The most significant person in Rostov's life became a little girl named Nina. Together, Nina is the daughter of a revolutionary officer, and they are living there in the hotel for a while. Together, they roamed all over the hotel, every nook and cranny, from the furnace rooms to the switchboard. Nina became his link to the future and to the outside world, until she had to leave at about the age 13. With her father, when Stalin came to power. Before she departed, she gifted the Count with her secret possession, a stolen master key, passkey to every room in the hotel. As the years passed, Count Rostov became chief of staff in the dining room. He used all of his alliances he has made with people at the hotel and old aristocrats, and with young people trying to build a new Russia too. Anna Urbanov, the actress in Nina, as a 20-year-old, re-enter his life, as does a 5-year-old, to whom he becomes a father figure. She's very significant. History marches on until the final chapters. Does he ever leave the Metropole? I'm not going to tell you. I love this book very much. It is lots of fun, and you do learn a lot of history too. And I can't wait for the movie.
So before I offer some brief closing remarks, I just want to mention that today happened because of Annette Lansford. It's her years of effort and titles and preparation and attending to details and asking lots and lots of people to read books and review them. And so someone had mentioned that it kind of feels like one of the old literary teas post-COVID, and it kind of shut us down for a little bit. So today has been really enjoyable in that regard. I also want, if you could turn to the third page of your program. I learned today that I should have included Dawn Longfellow under the Wesley staff, I think. And so we will make sure that she knows that we appreciate her hard work in addition to all the other staff, those of you who brought refreshments, who helped choose titles, who reviewed books, and who gave up some time on a beautiful Sunday afternoon to come out here. One thing, if you can look at the quote that is from the author of Homebound on this last page, I think it's interesting that we've heard about all these poignant events and people and legacies, and the author of Homegoing reflected in an interview on the process of writing and also on research. And so she talks about all the trauma that came with essentially reliving many painful facets of her past. And toward the end of that, she notes that she sees historical fiction as an opportunity to kind of resurrect the lives of characters who might have gone through these situations and honor those lives. Doing the writing felt in some ways as an act of love and justice. So as we've learned here, as we leave here today, and as you possibly read either one of these titles or one of the many on the back, I think it's important to note that if what authors are offering is an act of love and justice, then perhaps the least we can do as readers is pick those books up, absorb their lessons, and reflect upon how they react in terms of our own life and our current society. Thank you all for your time today.